Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Resplendent Throne by Ocha, narrated by Robbie MacLeòid. Chapter 1. Gila felt the intrusion like a barnacle between his shoulder blades. He was not used to having a corporeal form, but the sensation transcended the spirit-formed flesh, the sinews, the bones. Throughout aeons, he had never felt the need for a physical metaphor, until now. He wanted to scream. This was not supposed to happen. All of the work he had painstakingly done, building his body from scratch, drawing deeply upon the triune threads of spirit and pathos and will, the focus, the strength, now teetered on the precipice of unraveling like so much wool. That freshly built body now ached with the overextension of spirit. Spirit exhaustion hurt on a cellular level. No, a molecular level. It drained one's energy to the point that electrons moved as slowly as if they'd been frozen. It left his body prickling with the sensation of 1,000,000 infinitesimal needles rippling across his flesh. With effort, he got to his feet, supporting himself against a large boulder splattered with blotches of multicolored lichens, like alternating pale green and rust red filigree. Gila had no idea how long he had been unconscious. He shuddered at the mere thought of being rendered insensible. Yet it had happened as he had tried, and failed, to harness a herd of deer, and though his strength returned, he felt the memory of that all-consuming, dreamless void, like staring into a black hole. And now that he had awoken once more, that God's forsaken barnacle was still there. The land around him veritably roiled with spirit. The first waves of ascension were always the most tumultuous, and this unrest would likely last for some time. Gila had only a vague awareness of how long it took this dismal, worthless rock to make a circuit of its star, but even that was enough to posit that the people here would be occupied long enough for his purposes. He hadn't expected resistance. Oh, Gila knew he would encounter aggression, that much was a given. But once his pathos passed from his powerful spirit into its new and unwilling host, that was supposed to be the end of it. For most, it had been. His creatures sought out the biggest threats and left him trails. They couldn't help but manifest his will on this land. Or so he had thought. It had started with that human. Not the first one, no. That one was consumed enough by his guilt that Gila had found steady purchase, and anyway, that first human had perished. It was the second one. Perhaps it was that the second one had been infected by the first and not Gila himself, but further evidence refuted that vain hope. While he could still feel this second human's alignment with Gila's programming, it was this human who was a barnacle between Gila's shoulder blades. Always present, sharp edges and stubbornness and a shrewdness that ought to have long since vanished into rage. It hadn't stopped there. Gila felt the corvids circling to the east. He had sent them north, and they had obeyed at first, until they didn't. Now they lurked far enough away that Gila could not even act upon them. He forced himself to look upon the land. It had been sparsely populated before the ascension, and was sparsely populated now. This part of Earth was some sort of scenic park, he thought, full of lakes and rolling hills. That information was virtually useless. Gila had no need of fresh water or inane viewpoints. The existing population was another matter, of course, but he could do nothing at all about that for now. That knowledge ate at him, worming under his new-made skin like burrowing larvae. Bide, Gila. Time is on your side. Gila drew a breath through his nostrils, feeling the cool air pass over the fine hairs upon his upper lip. When he breathed out once more, the air was warmed by his body. There. That was better. He had come here as barely a wisp of consciousness, and in such a short time he had built himself a form of his own. He could, and would, surmount this obstacle too. Brushing the remnants of disturbance from his consciousness, Gile began to form a plan. His greatest threat was to the north. It rang out like a beacon in his mind, a nascent danger. This being was not yet a true threat, but the whisper of it was there. That it existed at all was remarkable enough in this world that had yet to even drag itself out of the muck of scarcity and violence and squabbles. Ultimately, though, it mattered not. Whoever this was lacked Gile's strengths, experience, will. Nonetheless, Gile needed to ensure that he approached with caution. Compared to the people of this planet, he was a god, but he was a god who had, like them, begun once more at the lowest rung of the ladder. Support was imperative. The deer had been a miscalculation. Being as he was, Gile had no class and no helpful updates from the Ascended Alliance. All he had was his memories, his instincts, and his knowledge of spirit. He'd no way of knowing his limits until he hit them, and either transcended them or was humbled. Grudgingly, Gile admitted that he could not simply harness other avian species. Not now. Not yet. He needed to further build his strength, and that meant working with what he had, however inconvenient. If he could not reach the corvids from here, he would go to them, and they would learn their folly. Some part of him was aware that if they saw him coming, they would simply fly away, and Gile himself was not yet capable of flight. Yet. Gile was capable of stealth. They would never even see him coming. None of them would ever see him coming. He held on to that thought, ignoring his own irrationality, but still that horrid barnacle lingered in the center of his back, with sharp edges and tenacious obstinance. Once Gile had handled the corvids, he would handle that too, and then he would turn his focus to the north. Chapter 2. Explain it to me like I'm 5, I said, scrubbing my face with a towel to keep the sweat from running into my eyes. Even with the wind coming in from the bay, I was roasting, and an overheated brain did not get on well with maths. Think of it like the Richter scale, Meeksy said patiently. Or at least patiently compared to Ronald, who'd gotten so annoyed that he'd gone off to punch something for real instead of staying to spar. Right, I said. Something a 10-pointer is exponentially more powerful than a 9-pointer. You're sure this is how it works? Meeksy had been about to say something else, but he closed his mouth again, the tightness at the corners of his mouth barely disguised by the neatly trimmed beard that covered most of his face. Maybe not so patient. Rather than risk further cracks in his veneer of calm, I planted the butt of my staff on the tarmac, unable to resist giving it a jiggle to feel yet again how the crafters of Oban had made tarmac into something that wouldn't absolutely wreck us if we face-planted on it, which we did often these days. Now the formerly hard surface had a give to it, like rubber, but more responsive to reciprocal force. The physics nerds of Argyll were having a field day. I mean, no, Meeksy replied finally, exasperation creeping into his voice. This is still conjecture, but it would explain why enemies only a couple levels above us have absolutely handed our arses to us. If it's right, though, wouldn't Bobag have been unstoppable? I squinted at my friend. He was level 37 compared to us in our teens, unless the Ascension's punishment really made him that vulnerable. Mixie nodded eagerly. That's just the thing. It stripped him of his class bonuses, and it seems like, at least to a degree, having those bonuses is partly what allows for the leap. Also, we've had our own perks helping us that he didn't. I took a deep breath, leaning my head first to one side and then the other to stretch my neck. Part of me didn't really give a toss why we'd beaten Bobag. We had killed the bastard, and that was what counted. But at the same time, there would likely be others like him. Most games I'd played in the days pre-Ascension made the experience gain stretch more and more between levels, which was true to an extent for us, but it still didn't account for Bobag having 20 levels on us. You'd think if the power differential was so exponential, they'd make it harder to hit higher levels, I said absently, looking out over the harbour, where a pair of fishing boats made their way into the sheltered bay between the arms of the Isles of Lismore and Kerrera. The small spire of Hutchison's monument at the northernmost tip of Kerrera stood out even from this distance, pointing skyward. You say to explain like you're 5, then you say that, Mixie muttered, following my gaze. Not that deep, mate, I caught his eye and shrugged. Just seems like they'd make us grind more, if that were the case. Aye, that'd be my assumption. But Mixie frowned, staring past me now. Then again, we're the outlier in every way, I said, on sudden inspiration. Sure, that power differential matters a lot when you've got people like Bobag around, and to us, it seems impossible that there'd be some place anywhere that didn't have his sort, but maybe it's usually moot. The sweat was starting to dry on my face and neck, sending a chill through me that had naught to do with the way Mixie was suddenly looking like he'd swallowed a live rat. No, that... Bugger. Mixie let out an annoyed sigh. I bet that is it. We've been working with a shite assumption that there was a paradox, when maybe there just isn't one. The paradox being that their whole work-together shtick clashed with the way higher levels are able to crush lower levels, like swatting an entire swarm of midgies in one swipe. Mixie's exasperation washed away with the gust of salty air that came in from the waves. Excitement crept in to take its place, and his dark eyes veritably sparkled. If they were only talking a big game about cooperation and all, that'd be one thing. But if the places that usually ascend are really starting from a point where they're not having slap fights over land and power, that would actually make sense. I couldn't blame my friend for the relief in his voice, or the relief I felt. At first, it had seemed like murdering one's way through the populace was a tantalizingly efficient way to level up, and, to an extent, that was true. But Bobag and his flunkies had found out the hard way that brute force only went so far in an ascended world. A grin started to tug at the corner of my mouth, and Mixie mirrored it. We could make a proper go of this, he said. The yearning in his voice wasn't lost on me. After years of pandemic and war and, well, human slap fighting over land and power, it felt like that brisk breeze flowing in from the Sound of Mull. Fresh, clean air, and a hope of change for the better. Not far from where we stood, the mythic Berlin we'd built to cross Loch Awe weeks before floated in berth at the pier's wharf. Berlin and Chaun Hewish was its name. It stood as a symbol of what an ascended people could create together. I was just about to say something about it, even as Meeksy loosened his shoulders to get back to sparring. Naturally, that was when Oban's wards rang out with a deep, threatening gong. Brach Menevna flared on my back where I'd placed the weapon, or rather, where my living staff had grabbed hold of my armor, and the pulse of spirit from it did nothing to lessen the sudden dread. Meeksy and I were off running, him panting beside me, heading to the north. Clouds scudded across the sky, and I spotted rain in the distance up in Ardnamurchan, but it wouldn't reach us for a while yet. For now, we had dry pavements and the shock of our ever-changing ascended landscape. As my legs pumped to propel me on the path to the breach, I still couldn't help but goggle at the differences between the Oban I grew up in and the Oban we now called home. All cars had been gathered and their materials repurposed. With ascension crafting, it was terrifyingly easy to strip them to components and make something new from the rubber and metal and glass. The rubber had gone into the sparring area on the North Harbour, the metal into weapons and armour and tools. What was left was streets that seemed far wider than they ever had. A silence in the wake of the vehicles and the air left cleaner with the absence of their exhaust. Beyond that, the bed and breakfasts, the hotels, all of the empty holiday lets owned by folk who didn't deign to spend more than a handful of weeks out of the year here, all of that, community housing now. It gave me a fierce sort of glee to see it. For so long, folk like me had been forced out of the Highlands and Islands because we couldn't outbid people who only wanted tourism money and never intended our houses to be homes. Now the landlords could go hang. We'd been here to defend this land when they hadn't. For maybe the first time in Scotland's history, the land belonged to the people who tended it. People still poured into Oban from the outlying areas as word spread. In the month since we'd defeated Bobag, the quiet had transformed into life. And now, as Meeksy and I fell in with another band of higher-leveled fighters with a nod, we saw faces peering out windows at us, along with a few tentative waves. Anomalies? One of the new additions to our sudden trail run asked the question of me. "Dinna ken," I said. "We were at the harbour sparring." We passed Witchwood House with its stately stone and gables, not far south of the Dogstone, and that was as far as we needed to go. Perched on the top of the stone itself, and visible even from 500 meters away, was an enormous golden eagle. Golden eagles were already enormous birds before the ascension, but now they put Tolkien's to shame. The raptors were a year-round presence in Scotland, elusive in their grandeur. Mull was often the best place to look for them, and if you were lucky enough to see one, you'd scarce doubt it. With a 2-meter wingspan, if they came anywhere near you, it'd take your breath away to see them aloft. This particular specimen was probably more than 2 meters, tall. Its wingspan, if it were to spread those massive things, would easily be double that. The bird made the tree growing out of the top of the Dogstone look like a sapling. "Holy shit," someone said behind me, and I had to agree. As we got closer, I saw the team of fighters on duty at this edge of the town border hanging back warily, necks craned to watch the eagle. It was eating a grey seal. Grey seals, if my fuzzy memory served me, weighed several 100 pounds. A familiar head of auburn hair turned to look our direction. My heart gave a little patter at the sight of Ailey Mackintosh, my heart's palpitations a phenomenon that still felt new after the last month. as was the dopey grin that spread across my face, even more notable for the fact that she returned it with a wide smile, every bit as dopey. "Ah, girl," Meeksy murmured, between heaving breaths as our pace finally slowed. His sighing about love didn't bother me in the slightest. He was one to talk anyway, with him and Ian every bit as twitterpated as freshers with their first crushes even after years together. But Meeksy had earned the right to take the piss. The other folks sniggering, on the other hand, got a sharp look and responded with a few gulps. Ailey came to meet us, glancing back once over her shoulder at the golden eagle before breaking into a trot. "Hey," she said to me, her eyes still full of warmth I couldn't believe was for me. "It hasn't caused any trouble, except for the seal, I guess." "Aye, that seal had a bad day," I agreed. Unlike the goshawk, which had attacked us in the middle of the night, this eagle was clearly otherwise occupied. Clachachon, the Gallic name for the dogstone, was a decent place for a giant bird to eat uninterrupted. Reflexively, I reached out to the golden eagle with connection and a thread of táthag. I wasn't really trying to create a bond with the bird, but I was curious. She seemed to reciprocate that curiosity. With some amusement, the touch of her mind told me that she'd not just chosen Clachachon for a luncheon spot for its height. We'd activated a different kind of stone not long after defeating Bawbag, the keystone that protected the town from invading forces. But we had wards in place too, in case of more mundane threats. The golden eagle, it seemed, could sense both. Safety, nest, home was the predominant impression I got from her, along with a fierce admiration. People used bird brain to mean stupidity, but this creature's brain was easily 5 times the size of a human's, and had clearly grown its intelligence right alongside its sheer volume of brain matter. Somewhat cautiously, I returned the same impression she had given me. Safety, nest, home. Protection and community, I added to it. Eagles were often solitary birds, but the respect she returned with my offered thought told me she saw the value in a flock. Her stomach satisfied on seal meat, she paused in her gruesome lunch to lift her blood-covered beak. The eagle's head cocked to the side as she gazed at me. To my utter surprise, the next thought that came to me from her mind was something I could only describe as asking for permission. Like me, she wasn't looking for a bond, or at least not the type that táthag offered. What she wanted was what we had. Safety, nest, home? Flummoxed, I looked around at the others. I wasn't in charge here. We didn't have anyone who fit that description. "She wants to know if she can live here," I said aloud, seeing a few startled heads turn in my direction. "The eagle. She admires us and wants to stay." "What?" Meeksy turned on his heel to look at me. "You're talking to birds now." I shrugged. "She wants to stay." Pausing, I listened, cracking a smile in the raptor's direction. She'd resumed eating, seemingly unbothered by the squawking of flightless humans, or, as was maybe more correct these days, elves. But despite her nonchalance, she was indeed invested in my answer. The next thought that came through from her was another series of impressions, these ones of soaring high above the Minch to the west, beyond Mull and Egg. The fish were changing there, big enough to sustain her, and she could be helpful to us without being a burden. That all of that came through, with little doing from me, told me this eagle had grown in far, far more than simple wingspan alone. She says she won't hunt here, and she won't hunt people, I said slowly. She's offering to not just shelter here, but to be part of our community. Every time I think I've seen the weirdest shit possible, this shit gets weirder, muttered a woman whose name I didn't know, quickly silenced by an elbow to the ribcage from another woman who looked like she had to be a sister. Pale cheeks flushed pink as they both caught me looking at them. Any objections to our feathered friend? I asked dryly. Aside from the weirdness quotient. After a moment of hesitation, heads shook. If she can pick up a seal, do you reckon? This came from a wide-eyed young lad, probably in his early 20s, and it was hushed just as quickly, this time by Meeksy. Satisfied, I reached out to the eagle once more, extending our welcome. The giant raptor straightened up from where she'd been eating again, and her feathers puffed up in pride. With an ear-splitting screech of triumph, the golden eagle winged her way into the sky. Her feathers sent gusts of wind and dislodged leaves and dirt hurtling towards us where we stood in awe. One enormous feather drifted downwards from her exit, and, without a thought, I walked over to it. It was as long as my arm, heavy when I picked it up. I had the sudden, absurd image of Ailey sprawled languidly in a meadow with someone fanning her with this single giant feather. You know, Ailey said thoughtfully, chasing the errant thought from my head as she stared after Oban's newest inhabitant. I reckon she triggered the wards on purpose. She knew exactly what she wanted, and I think she knew who she wanted to talk to. At that, every eye turned to me where I stood, holding the feather in both hands as it caught the gust of wind blowing in from the sea. I hastily tucked it away into my inventory. My wren friend is going to be jealous, was all I could think to say in response. Chapter 3. With the wards of false alarm, and no further incidents of anomalies corrupting the countryside, we quickly settled back into our still young routine. For me, that meant time with Brachmenivna, and a lot of time crafting. It felt like curiosity had infected the entire town. Maybe it was that most people's jobs had vanished overnight. Maybe it was purely that magic was suddenly real and accessible to everyone. But it felt like that first month had ignited a fire under everyone's arse to explore what this ascension had made possible. People poured in from the rest of Argyll, but people also trickled out. Many wanted to search for family and friends who had stayed out with Argyll. Others went to establish lines of communication, which wasn't going nearly as quickly as anyone had hoped. While we had communication crystals galore now, and the promise of instantaneous travel, the communication crystals at this level only worked over a few miles, and until another community was able to establish itself, the whole teleportation thing was moot. Even so, lines of connection inched outwards from the town, and within Oban itself, people made miracles. The first thing had been sanitation. One thing you learn really bloody quick in an apocalypse is just how fast you start caring about plumbing and sewage. All the little things we'd taken for granted living in the 21st century meant there was an immediate fervor in favor of, well, fixing shit. Literally. Or maybe fixing shitters. Plumbers and mages worked together on drainage and wastewater, and simply making sure the people of our community had running clean water. With what we'd learned from my woodworking and Elisich's further experimentation, it was less a matter of how, and more a matter of how quickly can we get round to every occupied home. From there, boilers quickly got disconnected from gas lines and reconnected to enchantments and glyphs. The collective cry of ecstatic relief when hot showers returned? Aye.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?